Hi everyone, welcome back. This is episode 3 in our series on the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook. In this episode we're going to talk about the green pages, and a lot of folks have a little apprehension about the green pages. There's a lot of information there, but it's good information and we're going to pick it apart. We're going to help you understand the green pages so that it works for you out here on your scene. Just want to remind you to subscribe to the channel. And make sure you hit the notification button so that you get the notifications for the new uploads, for new content. And if you're just joining us for this episode, just understand that this is a series on the Emergency Response Guidebook, and we've got several episodes. So go back, start at the overview episode, and then join us. And I want to point out that this episode, this will make sense in just a few minutes. This episode is brought to you by the security team here at Hazmat Ops Training. Thanks. In the previous episodes, we've talked about the yellow, the blue, and the orange pages, as well as gotten into the flowchart a little bit. So we're going to continue down the flowchart in this episode. So if you would, grab your 2020 ERG, flip over to page 1 for the flowchart, and we'll get started right after this. Okay, so we're here on the flowchart. Before we start, I want to point out a couple of things about the green pages. And here on the flowchart, you'll see just below the very first green box there where it says, is the material highlighted in green? You'll see that it starts to ask a series of questions, just like the flowchart's been doing. But there's two places in the ERG where we have evacuation and isolation distances. And that's in the orange pages. We've talked about that in previous episodes, and also in the green pages, which we're going to concentrate on in this episode. So the green pages concentrate on 3 different things when it comes to materials. The biggest thing that we need to remember is that these materials are toxic by inhalation. So they have a toxic inhalation hazard. Remember that, TIH for short, toxic inhalation hazard. You'll also see in this book and other places, you may see poison by inhalation. So toxic by inhalation, TIH, or poison by inhalation, PIH, same thing. For the purposes of what we're doing here, those mean the exact same thing. So that's what we're talking about with the green pages. Toxic by inhalation or poison by inhalation hazard materials. All right, so the other thing that the green pages do for us is identify water reactive materials and the byproducts of the reaction that takes place when those materials are introduced to water. We'll talk about that in Table 2, some really neat ways that the book handles that. And then chemical warfare agents. We've addressed chemical warfare agents briefly in the blue and the yellow pages, and we'll talk a little bit more about how those are handled in the green pages in this episode as well. So let's get straight to the flow chart. And you'll see what we've already done. I'm going to bump up just a little bit so that we kind of remind ourselves about the yellows and the blue pages that we've looked at in the other episodes, as well as placards and labels. We'll talk more about placards and labels in the final episode, as well as we'll have other subsequent episodes on highway and rail. But just to kind of refresh, the yellows and blues, or the placard or container silhouette pages that takes us to the orange pages. So again, we do have evacuation information on the orange pages, but we want to understand in this episode this box right here, and I'm going to try to be still there for a second. This box right here, and I'm circling it with my cursor. So we've talked about the polymerization hazard. So as we move on down the flowchart here, the next box that we want to talk about, the question here is the material highlighted in green? So when we look up the 4-digit ID number in the blue or the yellow pages for the ID number, proper ship and name in the blue, when we look those up, If we see that that material is highlighted in green, and again, in the previous episodes we've talked about that, we've looked at that. There's a number of, all you have to do is flip to just about any page in the blue or the yellow, and you'll see those green highlighted materials. So if the answer to that is no, then we don't have to worry about the green pages. No big deal. We go on as we've done in the previous episodes. We take that 4-digit ID number, match it up in the yellows, take the proper shipping name, match it up in the blue pages, move to our orange pages, and we're pretty much, I won't say we're done, but we've done pretty much what the flowchart is designed for us to do. Now, if the material is highlighted in green, if the answer to that question is yes, then we're moving down the flowchart here. So the next question that it asks, if the answer is yes, that it is highlighted in green, the next question here, and I'm going to circle it with my cursor, is the material on fire? Yes or no? That makes a difference, okay? If the material itself, not the container impinged with fire, not fire near the material, but if the material itself is burning, then the chemical makeup or the chemical structure of the material is going to be changed. All right, so if the answer to that question is yes, then what we want to do is go over here to the left side. So we've got two errors. We've got a yes and a no for that question. Is the material on fire? So let's look at if the material is on fire. If the answer to the question is yes, then we're going to use the appropriate orange guides and look at the evacuation distance listed in the orange guide pages. Remember in the previous episode we talked about that. There's good stuff left side of the guide down toward the bottom of the page. So we've got some guidance for that. But what we also want to do, because this is a TIH, toxic inhalation hazard material, we also want to visit the green pages as well. We just want to go to the orange pages first because, again, the material is on fire. We need that guidance for what to do if the material is on fire, but also we need to go to the green pages after that point because of the residual material. There will be material left over. There could be material left in the tank. There could be a massive leak. There could be runoff that potentially is not on fire. There's all kinds of scenarios that we could see for residual material, and we need to address that. That material, again, TIH, PIH, toxic inhalation hazard, poison inhalation hazard material, we still need the information that the green pages are giving us. If the material is on fire, we just go to the orange pages first. All right, so let's look at the right side if the material is not on fire. The gist of it here is we go to the table 1 of the green pages first. If there's no fire, then this situation is what the green pages are designed for. Again, we still need to go to the orange pages, but we want to go to the green pages first. Here's the rationale behind that. These are toxic inhalation hazard materials. They're extremely dangerous materials. So we want to get the information for that evacuation, but first the isolation. Isolate not in 360 degrees in all directions for these materials because the green page information is specific to these nasty materials. So we need to get over there first, look at that isolation distance, look at that downwind evacuation distance, and go ahead and get that operation started before anything else. That's how serious these materials are. That's how dangerous they can be. So we want to protect the responders, protect the public. Let's get to that green page information first, then we'll look at the orange pages because we still need that information that's in the orange pages for some of the other stuff, the spill and leak considerations, maybe the first aid information, that kind of stuff, as well as some of the safety precautions that are on the left-hand side of the guide pages. So still really good information there for us in the orange pages. But we want to, if the material's not on fire, we want to get to that evacuation and isolation information first because of the serious nature of these materials. Now, you'll see some of these materials, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes, but you'll see some of these materials that will kind of make the list because they're water reactive and that they create a material that is toxic inhalation hazard as the byproduct. We'll talk about that specifically, but that's what this dotted line box down here is talking about. So just to recap quickly, is the material highlighted in green? If the answer is no, we go to the orange pages pretty much as scheduled, as discussed before. If the material is highlighted in green, there in the yellow or the blue section. Then we have another question: is the material on fire? Yes or no. If it is on fire, we go to the orange pages first. Then we consult the green pages because we need both pieces of information. If it's not on fire, we go to the green pages first, again, because of the serious nature, the serious danger of that material. But don't forget, we need to go to the orange pages to see about that information. All right, so there's a couple of things that we're going to concentrate on as we move through the green pages. The initial isolation distance, you've heard me say that several times. That's that 360 degrees in all directions, and we want to make sure that we keep everyone out. In addition to that, any responder in the initial isolation distance must be protected. So whatever the protective measure is recommended in the orange pages, whether that be chemical protective clothing, SCBA, whatever the case may be, any responder in that initial isolation distance must be protected. But we need to get the public out of that area as well. The other distance, or the other factor that we're going to talk about, is the downwind evacuation, or what the book talks about as protective action zone. So that's that downwind evacuation distance. There's a few things that will affect these distances that the green pages are going to give to us, and we'll get into that pretty deep here in just a few minutes. But I want to talk about some things that may increase, some factors that may increase these distances. One is weather. There could be some adverse weather conditions. There could be stronger winds than normal. There's a lot of things that the weather can play. And again, we'll talk some more about that as we go as well, because there's some differences in our distances for day and night. And quite simply because of weather and the things that the weather does at night that it doesn't necessarily do during the day. So weather is a really big factor, and if we've got some crazy stuff going on with the weather, we may want to consider some additional distances. Multiple materials mixed together. If you've got a lot of different things that are leaking, if you've got a really nasty situation, you may want to consider looking at increasing these distances as well. Some worst case scenario type stuff, terrorist type incidents, where it seems maybe that there's a calculated type of situation going on, you may want to consider increasing those distances as well. And the last thing that I'll say is, if you just get a gut feeling that I'm not comfortable with a half mile, I feel like a mile is better, or I'm not comfortable with 500 feet, I feel better about 1,000 feet, do it. Nobody, generally speaking, nobody's going to argue that. Your gut feeling, your experience, combined with the information in the ERG, is extremely important. We want to rely on that gut feeling. Sometimes you just get the feeling that we need some extra distance. Not a problem. I don't disagree with that at all. So let's go to page 294. That's the first page of the green pages, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so we're here on page 294. This is not the first page of the green section. There's a couple of more introductory pages, and I encourage you to read in some spare time. We're not going to go over everything in the video just for the sake of time, but I encourage you to read some extra information here that goes along with the green pages. But a few things that I really want to highlight. We've talked about in the other episodes about knowing what the wind direction is and some sources for getting that. Your dispatch centers, your National Weather Service offices are good sources for that. But we want to understand and know the wind direction. You'll see here on note number 3 on page 294, large and small spills. So we want to understand what the difference is for this book in a large and a small spill. Generally speaking, for liquid materials, we're looking at 55 U.S. gallons or less is considered a small spill. Anything over 55 gallons is considered, for liquids, is considered a large spill. For solid materials, we're looking at 660 pounds is the threshold. So here on note number 4, we'll look at the initial isolation distance, and we just want to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. So we have the spill location here, the initial isolation distance that's listed in the green pages. So we have our distance here, but then we want to make sure everyone understands that initial isolation distance is that distance 360 degrees, all the way, a perfect circle there for that initial isolation distance. We want to understand that. And then again, the protective action distance is our downwind evacuation. So let's look at page 295, if you're following along with me in your book. We'll go down to the middle of the page on 295. So for our downwind evacuation, again, you see we have our circle, again, illustrated our initial isolation zone. So we'll use 500 feet, okay? So for the spill location here, our downwind distance, 500 feet in that direction. And then you see half the distance on either side of that point for our going out away from the spill in the downwind direction. So we want to account for, and this cone here that you see is accounting for wind variation, and inevitably we're going to have wind variation. If you've got a southwest wind, it's not going to stay perfectly southwest all the time, so we need to account for that variation. So we'll take that center line 500 feet down, we'll go half the distance, so we'll go 250 feet to our left, 250 feet to our right. So essentially what we end up with is a square. So that's a 500 feet by 500 feet square evacuation, downwind evacuation distance. I want to just mention real quickly that our evacuation, when we're moving folks out of these areas, we want to move them perpendicular to the wind direction. So, and again, we'll look here on the screen. If we're moving folks out of this area, we don't necessarily want to move them straight downwind. We don't want to just, kind of run from the spill there or the vapor plume or whatever the case may be. We actually want to move those people perpendicular to the spill so that we're getting to the closest clean air possible, but at the same time in the direction of the wind, with the wind to our back, not facing the wind, but with the wind to our back and perpendicular to the spill or perpendicular to the wind direction. And then lastly, again, we understand what evacuation means, getting the public away. We understand what that isolation zone means, getting folks out of that area, and then only protected responders are in that area, kind of what we know as a hot zone. But there's also a consideration that we need to talk about quickly here, and that's sheltering in place. In some cases, it may not be possible to evacuate people. There's all kinds of considerations where sheltering in place may be a better option. The thing with sheltering in place is we need to have a place where people can isolate, where windows and doors can be closed, where entry and exit to that area can be limited, if not completely closed off. But also we need to be able to shut down HVAC systems. We want to limit the air exchange as well. Now this is a temporary place for people to shelter, but it's potentially something that we would have to do in certain cases. One thing that we must do if we're going to shelter in place with citizens is we've got to maintain contact with those people. If that area breaches, if there's a problem and they need to be rescued immediately, we have to be able to know that. So we've either got to give them a radio, we've got to put somebody there with them who's a protected responder, we've got to maintain phone contact. Somehow or the other, we've got to maintain contact because that situation in that shelter could go bad. It could go negatively. So we've got to have a way to know that and to rescue those people if that becomes the case. So if you would join me on page 304, and we're going to look at a selected page from table 1 in the green pages. So some of the things that we've talked about already, and I'll just direct your attention here to the top of the page where you see the large and the small spill columns. Remember we talked about 55 U.S. gallons is the delineation between large and small. For liquid spills, 660 pounds for solid materials between large and small. Pretty easy to remember. Again, that's back on page 294. That explanation, if you need to refer back to that later on when you're on scene at some point. I would like for you to look over at the left-hand side of the page. The 4-digit ID numbers are oriented the exact same way as they are in the yellow pages, where the 4-digit ID number is in the first column, the guide page. So if we're coming here first because the material's not on fire, and then we're going to the orange pages, we've essentially got the same setup, the same format as the yellow pages. That way we're not bouncing all over the book. So they've done a really good job setting that up. So 4-digit ID number, our guide column, and then the name of the material. So let's look at our columns. So we'll look at both the large and small. They're set up the exact same way. So once we've made the determination whether we're under a large or a small spill situation, you see the first column here is first isolate in all directions. We know that to be that 360 degree isolation area where we get all of the public out, and then only protected responders belong in that area after that. So you see here that it's set up in meters and in feet. The next column that you see is then protect persons downwind. So that's that protective action zone that we talked about, downwind evacuation. But you see here that we've got two columns under that, kind of two sub-columns under that downwind protective action zone. Daytime numbers and nighttime numbers, also set up in kilometers and miles. Okay, so the difference here, you say, well, why does it make a difference? What's the deal? The big difference is weather. So the situation that happens in most cases at night that affects the plume and will affect a material like some of these that we're talking about is that during the daytime we have the heating of the sun. So what that does is that helps, and typically we have more active wind currents during the day. So what that does is, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, the sunshine will heat the material. It makes it more active anyway. Generally speaking, our wind currents tend to be more active during the daytime. So the dispersal of the material, because it's warmer, because it's more active, because there's more wind to move it around, typically these materials will rise. They'll get up and away from us better during the day. At night, we don't have that. The sun goes down. Typically, the temperature goes down, and again, there's different places on the planet that these situations differ. There's different places from one side of a state to the other where these things differ. These are general statements. These are general rules. But generally speaking, at night, sun goes down, the atmosphere cools. So we don't have the heating of the sun to help to move the material around. Typically, our wind currents are a little more calm at night. So we don't have the dispersal, we don't have the push, if you will, for these materials to be pushed up and away, heated up and then pushed away. So what happens is your plumes for these materials at night, they tend to stay more compact because they're not being dispersed, they're not being heated, they're not being pushed by the wind, so they tend to stay more compact. And they tend to stay closer to the ground because of that heating is removed. The heating of the sunshine, the heat of the day is removed, so they tend to stay closer to the ground. What that does is creates that plume closer to the ground. It travels farther closer to the ground, and the concentration of toxicity or of that toxic vapor in that plume is much, much higher. Does it move slower? Yes, typically it will, but the fact is the toxicity in that plume is higher. People are less mobile at night. You don't have the visibility at night. People are asleep and need to be woken up and need to be moved. It's just simply harder to do at night. So all of these factors go into why you see here that the nighttime distances are in most cases at least double, sometimes triple, and you'll even see them quadruple at night. It all depends on the material. So let's look over here and look at the very first one, and there's a reason that I picked this page. We'll talk about that as we get to the bottom of the page. But you see here ID number 1695. It's chloroacetone stabilized. Guide number 131 is our guide page when we get ready to go back for that. Small spill initial isolation distance is 100 feet. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's a liquid material. Doesn't the orange page say 150 feet? Yes, it does. This is a little bit less than that, but remember the orange pages represent multiple materials. The science, the research behind chloroacetone for a small spill calls for 100 feet. The 150 feet general in the orange pages for liquid materials is based on all liquid materials, and it's kind of a generalized distance. That's a really good thing, because a lot of times it'll give us a little bit more of a safety factor. So just understand that these materials over here in the green pages have had research. There's some specific research that's gone into these numbers, so they will be a little bit different. Don't let that throw you. Don't think that there's something wrong, that the book is made a mistake, because it's quite frankly in the research. So let's look, and you'll see here that this material, it doesn't say when spilled in water. A number of these say when spilled in water. So the important thing to remember here, and we'll just bump right down to the next one, acetyl bromide when spilled in water. So you see it listed only one time. It doesn't say when spilled on land, but it does say when spilled on water. So that means that this material kind of makes the list for table 1 here, because it's a water reactive material and it produces a toxic inhalation hazard material by virtue of that reaction to water. So if acetyl bromide is not in water, if acetyl bromide has not been introduced to water and that reaction has not taken place, then it's not going to make the list, essentially. So if it's not spilled in water, we don't belong in the green pages in this particular situation. So if we see that, if we get over here to acetyl bromide and we say, well, wait a minute, it's only when spilled in water, our spill doesn't deal with water, then we'll just go back to the orange pages. That's where we belong in that particular situation. So a lot of people will say, well, wait a minute, what if we're outside? What if it starts raining? What if somehow or another, through exposure protection or through any other type of situation that comes up, it's introduced in water? Wouldn't we want to default to this distance? Sure. That's not a problem. And a lot of folks choose to do that. That's not an issue. Just understand that this entry here, it kind of makes the list because it's a water reactive material. This information is based on that reaction. All right, so having said that, let's look at one that's kind of both. And down here at the bottom of the page, you'll see boron trichloride. And it's listed here, 1741. So you see it essentially listed twice. So boron trichloride when spilled on land, boron trichloride when spilled on water. What this means is this material carries that toxic inhalation hazard all on its own. Okay? So when it's spilled on land, it's a TIH, PIH material, but it's also water reactive. And when it has that reaction with the water, it creates another toxic inhalation hazard materials. So it kind of makes the list twice, on its own and by virtue of being water reactive, in that it's making another material that in itself is toxic inhalation hazard. So now we want to talk about our table 2 in the green pages. We've talked about our water reactive materials, and when you see that bold when spilled in water in parentheses under an entry. So when we see that, and that's the case, that our material is spilled in water, we do have an active spill, it's in water, that is our situation, then we want to follow the guidance in table 1. But we also want to flip over here to Table 2. It starts on page 345. So if you're following along, join me on 345. And you'll see here, again, Table 2 is set up just like the yellow pages in that we have the 4-digit ID number along the left-hand side, the guide pages, and then the name of the material. The difference for Table 2 is it's given us the material that's produced in that water reaction. So we have a water reactive material that's producing a toxic inhalation hazard material by virtue of that reaction. Again, some of them are in Table 1 by virtue of being toxic inhalation by themselves. And we've covered that. So let's look down here at the bottom. You'll see in the far right hand column the material that's produced, but it's kind of its nickname or its abbreviation is over there in that column, just simply for space. But the book does a really good job of explaining. Down here at the bottom, you'll see those codes. You can kind of cross-reference those and look and see what that material is. Now, here's the good news. A lot of people ask, well, now if it produces hydrogen cyanide, do I now have to go look up hydrogen cyanide to see what the distance is for that? And the answer is no. But because Table 1, because that research has already been done, you don't have to then go back and look for the byproducts distances. That information has already been, and that consideration has already been taken in Table 1 for those distances. And then lastly, starting on page 351, what we're looking at here at Table 3 is 6 of the most commonly transported toxic inhalation hazard materials. So the more commonly transported, remember the book's set up for transportation, so the most commonly transported TIH materials are listed here in Table 3. This the top 6. The simple thing is you have same thing, you have your day and night. You also have some wind variations, so kind of like some low, moderate, and high wind speeds. And then you have a selection of variations, 4 different variations for different types of containers or different types of transport vessels. So these are for the 6 most common. It's extra information, it's additional information for those top 6, but remember, they're the 6 most commonly transported TIH materials. So you're subject to run across these probably a lot more often than a lot of the other ones that you'll find in the green pages. So Table 3 is extremely useful because we may see those. And with the different variations of the container types, it gives us just some really good extra information to consider for those evacuation distances. Hey, thanks again for joining us. Be sure and click the subscribe button and the notifications so you can look at our playlists. Remember, this ERG series has several episodes, so you want to make sure you catch the first stuff so that the rest of it makes sense. But make sure you do that. Please, please, please put any questions that you have down in the comments. Remember, this channel's for you. We want to help you work through your incidents. We want to help you work through your training programs. We want to be that go-to for you. So make sure that you do that. Check out the description. My email's there. We've got some links to some other stuff that we've talked about in previous episodes there. So be sure you check that out. See you next time.